Hey, it's Dr. Crone again. So this is the first of two lectures in our education policy unit. In this lecture, we're going to talk about potential problems with education in the US and then how governments, especially state governments, have solved them. So this slide just shows some polling results from a poll that's done every year about the public attitudes towards US schools. And so on the left, you can see what respondents gave as grades to the public school system in the nation as a whole. Obviously, the most common response by far was C. And if you add C and D together, you can see that 2/3 of Americans really aren't so thrilled with the education system in the United States. It's kind of interesting that in the column on the right, you can see that people tend to be more positive about the public schools in their community, where B is the more common answer there. And we don't see a majority in the C and D range. So anyway, that's just to let you know that in general, a lot of people think that, hey, there's something wrong with the schools, or at least there's something to be improved with the schools. So the issue of whether or not US schools are failing and who's to blame for that has been a big deal for a really long time. Your textbook kind of talks about that as well. It just depends on who you ask, who they point the finger at in terms of blame. And I'm sure you guys have your own ideas about that as well. Some people say standards are too low. We need higher standards for students. Some people say all these standards are just too limiting. They make teachers teach to the test, and then teachers are less effective. So if we didn't have standards or US standards, it would be easier or better. Some people blame the curriculum. It emphasizes the wrong things. It's too much fluff in it. Some people blame the students. They're too lazy, they don't care, they're not able to learn, or they don't try hard enough. Some people blame the parents. Some people blame teachers. A lot of people blame the bureaucracy or the administration of the school. There's too much bureaucracy, too much overhead, not enough resources spent in the classroom, too much spent on the bureaucrats. A lot of people blame politics. Politicians shouldn't meddle in education. When they get their hands in there, it messes things up. Of course, the fact that we have federalism in the United States means that the different levels of government can blame each other. So some people blame the states. Usually the national government blames the states. They don't spend enough money on education, or their standards are too low. But then we can also blame the federal government. There's too much interference and regulation at the federal level. They should stay out of things. And then some people throw their hands up and say, poverty is really the explanation that explains whether students succeed or not, and that poverty makes it so difficult for students to succeed that really schools, even the best schools, would have trouble educating students when they are not getting their basic needs met. So all of these are potential explanations for a big, complicated problem. And I'm sure you guys have your own opinions on these as well. So it can also be controversial just to figure out whether we think schools have problems or not, and how the heck should we measure that? Yes, most Americans do have a view that in general our national schools aren't performing as well as they could be. But in order to try to improve the schools, politicians have to know what's wrong and how the problem can be fixed. And they have to know whether there's a problem to begin with, and maybe how they're doing in one state compared to other states. So one way to start the process of trying to figure out how to fix schools is to measure education outcomes and kind of compare them across states. And this is something that's become more and more sort of an obsession of people in education policy over the last 20, 25 years or so. So the idea of measuring educational outcomes is that states can benefit from figuring out which states are doing well with education, which are not, and then trying to learn from the successful states. So it's sort of that laboratories of democracy idea. So this map is going to show us an index measure. It's very well respected. It's one that a lot of people use. It's done by a research group called Education Week. They're a publication that writes a lot on education policy. But this is a very complicated set of indexes that goes into these. A couple things that are measured are standardized test scores, those things you love to hate, graduation rates, the availability of preschool or kindergarten education, rates of college attendance, levels of teacher pay, state spending on education as a percentage of the state budget. All of those things kind of go into this measure. Some people argue that these are not good measures of educational success. We shouldn't even be looking at this. But if you do want a measure that compares states, we need a standardized way to do that, and this index definitely gives us a measure. I'm sure you can see here, and hopefully you're interested in where Ohio is with a C, solid C, not a C plus, as of this past year, 2019. You might be interested in where the state is that you're studying. Couple of takeaways I see here is, first of all, no state gets an A, so there's room for improvement. I think in the past there have been a few years when there's been an A state. Usually it's Massachusetts, but not nobody this year anyway. And then the other thing we can take away from is that there's a big cluster of success in education on the northeast coast, the Atlantic coast. And that, other areas we can look and see sort of geographical areas where education is not as strong, particularly we see that in the southern states and also the far western states as well. So another way that schools are measured and compared with each other is every state is required now by the federal government to report on state government school district report cards. They also publish these, by the way, for each individual school building. So the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is the current version of federal law trying to measure school performance, they do require that states test students in order to qualify for funding from the Department of Education and the National Department. Now, this is fiscal federalism, so the states don't have to do these tests if they don't want to, but if they don't want to, they're ineligible for national education funding. So in practice, all of them do. So this represents Ohio's report card data for the most recent year. I guess it's from 2018. The 2019 information is still being compiled, so that'll be out, I think, in May. But these are school districts in Franklin County. I tried to pull those out and show you how they stacked up this current year. And you can see Hilliard did not do very well this year, and I know a lot of the teachers and administrators were upset about these and felt that they didn't really fairly reflect Hilliard achievement. I don't have time to go into more about these measures, but if you're interested in talking more about them or about the national data, just show up and chat with me in office hours, and I will love to fill you in because I could talk about this for a long time. I'm kind of a policy geek about this stuff. So that's kind of the difficulties involved in measuring whether there's a problem in education. Now we can look at, sort of which levels of government, who is responsible for solving public education problems. And all three levels of government do play a role in this. So we've got the national government, the state government, and local school districts. And we'll look at each one of those in turn. We'll kind of go in reverse order here. Look at these in turn and look at how they each can contribute to solving school problems. So the state government actually has an enormous role to play in public education. And that's really because if we look back to the 10th Amendment, education is a policy area that's reserved to the states under our US Constitution. The US Constitution doesn't say anything about education. In fact, when the early part of the founding of the United States, there was no such thing as free public education. And really that did not start to be a common thing in the US until the mid 1800s, and some states didn't really have strong public education until the late 1800s, early 1900s. So because the US Constitution doesn't say anything, that means it's reserved for the states. And not only that, but all 50 state constitutions guarantee the right to a public education for the citizens of the state. And so that means that you are, actually it's not just the citizens, it's for the residents of the state. And so that means that almost all major education policy making is done at the state level, big decisions about education. The day-to-day operation of the schools is delegated by the states to the local school districts. And remember, we've already talked about local school districts. If you remember, it's a special type of local government that's just in charge of running education in the local area. So the local school districts have power that's given to them by the state government, but the state government can also take that power away. So school districts, while they do have independent operating power, are not sovereign in any way, and they are supervised by the state and accountable to state government. So in Ohio and many other states, the state government can and does take over a school district if that school district is failing under the state report card values. So the Cleveland City Schools, for example, have been operated by the state for several years in a row now due to their failing achievement scores. The third level of government with influence over education is the federal government, and you might be wondering, why are they sticking their nose into this? Because it's a power reserved for the states. Well, hopefully you might be able to predict the answer is fiscal federalism. The federal government's ability to influence education comes from money that they have for grants and other things to give to school districts based on how well they meet standards. And that particular type of standard-based grants for states and local school districts really did not exist until 2002 when the No Child Left Behind Act was passed. That act has gone through several iterations. It was called Race to the Top for a while. It's now called Every Student Succeeds. It's not nearly as draconian of a law as it used to be. But that is the major way that the federal government can influence the decisions of states and local governments in education. But they also have other funding that they give to education that's not based on standards at all. So they influence higher education mostly by assisting students with need who qualify for grants and loans for higher education. They also give money directly to low-income K through 12 schools. And then a lot of their influence comes in the government runs a preschool program for children called Head Start that pays for kids to go to private preschools, kids in low-income areas or low-income children. And then the federal government funds almost all of the resources for disability education and special education. So for students that get resources of some kind, like having an aide in a classroom or a deaf interpreter or something like that, those are generally paid for by the federal government. So all of this, and especially since we're talking about fiscal federalism, brings up the question of how public education gets funded in the first place. So this graph just shows you the relative percent contributions to education over time from the three different levels of government. So one of the big takeaways from this chart is that green line on the bottom has always been a fairly small percentage that the federal government contributes. So even in these days, the federal government really, their assistance, their total assistance to public education is really only accounts for about 10% of education spending. So it's really the states and the school districts that provide the most. Back in the 20s and before that, local governments, the school districts almost entirely ran schools themselves and funded them themselves, generally relying on local property taxes. But somewhere in about between the 60s and the 80s, we saw the amount rise that states were investing into public education. Um, and so every district is going to have its own mix. Not every district has this exact same mix of the three sources of funding. But the state in Ohio especially uses a pretty complicated formula to decide how much money they actually give to each locality. So public education is very expensive, and the big issue in the United States is that it's extremely unequal. Um, and so I just pulled out the latest spending data for the school districts in Franklin County. Sorry, I should say Franklin County, not Franklin. Um, and you can see here spending per student ranged from a high of $18,000 in Upper Arlington to a low of 8,000 some dollars in Whitehall and Hamilton local school districts. Hilliard's in kind of the upper middle category there, but significantly lower than the spending in the most kind of well-off districts. And so this is something that this inequality of spending, something that people have worried about in the United States and policymakers and wondered kind of what does this. The big thing that drives public school spending and its inequality is really the fact that schools are so reliant on local property taxes. So the local district relies for at least half of its funding on local property taxes. And when I say property, I mean houses, also businesses, but for the most part, we're talking about what taxpayers pay if they own a house. So just a little bit to try to explain this. First of all, basic capitalism, property values go up when the demand for living in a certain area is high. Another thing you want to always keep in mind is people want to live that there's high demand for property in an area that has high quality schools. So that's going to increase the value of property there. It's going to increase the cost you have to pay to buy a house there. Schools are funded by a percentage tax on the value of the property. So that's basically what it is. So schools, if there's higher property values within a school district, those school districts are going to have more money to spend than a school district that has lower property values. And then what becomes a vicious cycle is that having more money spent is going to increase the quality of that education. It means you can pay teachers more, you can have more resources, you can have smaller classrooms, all the things we know contribute to better student success. And what happens is it's a reinforcing effect because therefore the property values will go even higher somewhere where the school is very successful, like Upper Arlington. And the property values correspondingly will go down in places where people see the schools not doing well and they move out of that school district. And therefore that means demand is lower for the housing there. And then you get in a situation like Whitehall where they just don't have the money to spend because the property values are so low. So to wrap this up, there have been a lot of states who have experienced court lawsuits brought against states that rely on this type of unequal funding for schools and rely on property taxes. And that was very popular in the 1990s, and we had one in Ohio. A young man, Nathan DeRolph, was the plaintiff in this case, and he, well, many people on behalf of him, but he was the face of the lawsuit, suing the state of Ohio, saying that Ohio Constitution guarantees an education and that this system meant that he was not eligible for an equal education in the state and that this was unconstitutional. And the Ohio Supreme Court agreed with him. They ruled he was right and that the relying on property taxes violates the Ohio Constitution's guarantee of a public education. And they ordered the legislature to fix the system. In the majority opinion, you can see what they said there to the General Assembly about what it needed to do. But the Ohio legislature refused to comply. They just said, nope, we're not doing that. We'll do a little bit, we'll change things up a little bit, we'll give a little bit more money to the schools, but we're not getting rid of the property tax system. And so DeRolph and a group of others actually went to the Supreme Court saying, please make them, it's not abiding by the U.S. Constitution for a legislature to ignore a Supreme Court order. But the U.S. Supreme Court did not grant cert to that lawsuit, so they never heard the lawsuit, and that's where things stand today. So technically, the legislature was ordered to change things, and they didn't. If you want to know more about that, there's a lot of stuff online if you want to look up DeRolph v. Ohio and dive into that, because it's a very interesting thing that happened. All right, that's all we've got for this video on education policy. So this was the first of two. After you watch both of them, you'll be ready to post on the discussion board. So I will see you next time.